any who have been away from a source of news for the last hour, hour and a half or two, the latest information, which is by no means certain, is that the missiles that landed in Israel have been numbered at probably no more than 7 and seem to have had only conventional warheads. The Israeli Defense Services reported about 45 minutes ago that the total casualties that they can count are 7 people lightly injured and no deaths. Like every other piece of information so far, that is enormously tentative and uncertain. War has been defined as the theater of surprise, and nothing is to be taken for granted. But for a moment, there seems to be a moment's worth of reason for at least human optimism in terms of human loss. As for diplomatic complications and the future of conflict, diplomacy, war, and peace in that region, quite literally, God knows. The possibilities are endless and most of them quite unpleasant. So I am faced with the problem that the gravity of the world that we live in these hours, is such that anything that I say here tonight is bound to be comparatively frivolous. And I searched my soul in the past 24 hours for a justification for continuing at all. And the thought that came to me, and it may not be a sufficient justification, but it's my justification on this occasion, is really the simplest old saw: life goes on. And there is a sense in which our continuance in ordinary things, even sometimes humorous things, is a tribute, A, to the human spirit, and B, to the unwillingness of people, even including us, to be intimidated into terminal solemnity by the grave affairs of our time. There is also the fact that this is to be my last lecture. I've debated with a couple of students and a couple of my colleagues whether that obliges me to commit suicide before morning. But I calculated that as we continue with our lives, and I with these remarks, we provide a possibility of something like closure, which is suggested by the last lecture of your life idea, a parousia, a wrapping up and completion of something, a story finished in finite time. And I calculated also that that would probably be popular, at least with some of my students and fellow faculty. Well, that was my chairman doing that. I anticipate that before I finish tonight, someone will have spray painted "Silent at Last" on the back of my jacket. So the last lecture of my life, and it presents me, as it has presented Professor Madsen before me, and will present Kenneth Sticker and others after me, with what I consider a dual problem. I'll call it the problem of temporal finality and the problem of causal finality. Temporal finality in the sense that this is supposed to be the last lecture. It's untrue. But it does tempt me powerfully, if this is indeed the last lecture, to pick targets of long-standing delight, which I have hitherto refrained from firing upon. And then there's what I call causal finality, from, as the little biography brochure tells you, my triple undergraduate major in history, literature, and philosophy. That is, it being the final lecture, what is it that my goals and will would like to shape it to be? So I thought of several targets, 2 in particular, which seemed to me obvious. The first, to speak my mind fully and frankly at last. Farewell, farewell to all my greatness, but first let me tell the administration what I really think of them. However, there are several counter problems in that choice. One of them is the falsity of the temporal finality. I still have to live with them for the next 3.5 years. A second is the fact that I could be at some pains to decide which administration, federal, state, county, city, or university, and past or present. And third, this, please, will you consider as a group confidence, in the sense that you would burn this newspaper after my letter has been published in it. I actually not only know, but personally like people in administration, perhaps not invariably, perhaps not every one. So I concluded that not only would it be a cranky and ungracious thing to do for the audience, but it would be rude to people whom I enjoy as friends and companions in life. My second target was the target of vanity. Here's a chance to sum up the wisdom that I have gained and stored in myself over what, at my final lecture, should be 35 years in the professorate, and at the end of considerably more than 50 years of the combined study and teaching of history. My wisdom. I reflected against that what a presumption it would be. To begin with, how can I certify that it's wise? How do I know that you would? And why should I trouble you with my conclusions when you're perfectly capable of forming your own, with certainly equal experience and equal intelligence? So I have decided to conform the subject of these remarks to something a good deal more benign. I've chosen to be boring rather than provocative or ill-mannered. And I'd like to sum up as best I may what's been best about my encounter with the discipline and subject matter of history and with the people that I have met in the process of that encounter, what it has meant to me and what I think I have drawn from it in terms of personal enrichment, what I think I've seen in it in terms of value. And these things I am prepared to defend as neither rude, nor ill-mannered, nor provocative. What I can't guarantee is that they will be at all interesting. I've divided the substance of these remarks into 3 parts. What for me has been the best about working within the discipline of history, my subject, my field, my career. To me, in general, the most general terms, I have enjoyed meeting the dead. I envy their perspective, admire their patience, and rejoice in what they can hint or say to us, though I am guarded by the fact that they too tell lies. It's just that they tell no new lies. And they make the most interesting company, sometimes outrageous company, sometimes delightful company, but unfailingly interesting. And thus I have enjoyed, in addition to those encounters, watching what I call the emergence of the past. I have a doctrine which when I taught historiography before my applauding chairman preempted it, I have a doctrine which I used to lay on those classes, and it is this: that the future does not yet exist except in the eye of God, and the present is a nanosecond of non-reality. The past is the real. With every breath we take, our bodies, our minds, our spirits are growing into the past, that breath being behind us. We are becoming history every instant of our lives. And so we are part of that enormous panorama and parade of the human in all its bewildering variety and varying qualities. To watch that process, to watch those whose future is long past, and to watch us whose future is instantly becoming past, and see them as parts of the same thing, has been a joy. The Commedia Humana, the human story told as a comedy. Not that there aren't long tears in it, but that among the things that I have found most rewarding, I am prepared to defend commedia in the classical sense as the most appropriate noun. First, encountering tides and tendencies. Motives, choices, contexts, consequences, being forced by the discipline of my profession to seek the consequence of any perceived fact or hypothetical fact, to seek the motive for any perceived choice by a human being, past or present, and to try with what precedents offer themselves to project possible ranges of consequence in the present and possibly seek alternative consequences to those most conventionally accepted for events in the past. If you say, for example, and this is going to be more than a little sensitive to many of you, I will not refrain from being just a little bit provocative now and again. As many say, in the best of conscience, that the Vietnam War was, in overall results and atrocity, significantly, if not solely, the fault of the United States and the choices of its government, a destructive and murderous irrelevancy to general history and to American history both, I find it interesting to look for alternative interpretations. You will see that there is a parallel to this in other matters in just a moment. For it might be held that the Vietnam War discouraged parallel seizures of power by liberation movements and benefactors of the people, almost uniformly murderous in our times, in Indonesia, in the Philippines, conceivably even in India. We don't know. But neither do we know, for we lack the depth of hindsight, the perspective depth of real historical time, that the first interpretative option is any more valid or absolute. And it helps keep a balance in interpretation, I find, and derive some pleasure from the finding, to discover, through seeking, that there is more than one way to interpret an event, even some events long past. Then the matter of contrasts in this commedia humana. Individual, group, cultural, epochal. How fares it with the human in this time or that time, in this family or that family, within this or that system of faith and values? How is it that the Tudor age in England can produce a play like Hamlet, one of whose central themes is vengeance, and a hero who is terribly troubled by that for varieties of interpretable reasons? While Japanese culture in the Genroku period, at the knuckle of the 18th Christian century, in the Tokugawa or Edo period of Japanese history, produces a play called Chushingura, in which 47 loyal retainers are confronted with the central mandate to exact vengeance for an injustice and a murder, and are overwhelmed with the necessity and the glory of doing it. How is it that in one culture, a parent or a grandparent will fight desperately for the lives of their children and grandchildren, and in a parallel culture will seek their suicide under certain moral circumstances, try to persuade them to kill themselves? And yet each is quite as human as the other. It's sometimes grim. And the challenge in it is to understand. It is a challenge, the pursuit of which confers a great deal of grim joy. Grim because the story is often grim. Joyful because the insights to be got by following it suggest that human is infinitely elastic as a concept and yet quite restricted as a basic fact. We all have emotions, but which? We all respond to stimuli, but how and to which stimuli? We all experience love, but under what circumstances and with what possibilities of fulfillment or of disappointment? Most cultures have some sense of tragedy or at least of misfortune, but the definitions vary vastly from one to another. How then to understand that? Well, I understand it in terms of the Commedia Humana, for which my archetype is Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. The array of profoundly different human beings, some weeping at what makes others giggle, some guffawing at what makes others cringe, and yet all exchanging, human to human, on the Canterbury Road. And there's been the pleasure of what I'll call the method and the morals of the discipline of history. To learn that even agreed upon facts must be viewed as possibly tentative, and that every interpretation of every set of facts must be conditional and restrained. Now, this is a shocking thing, perhaps, for some of you. It's saying that I'm confessing that my discipline does not confer exact, precise, totally correct, and definite answers to questions. Indeed, it doesn't. But it's easy to imagine, coming off that fact, people saying, well, then what good is it? We're getting nothing but a bunch of semi-educated guesses. Yes, but my rejoinder to that is, what value is some other discipline that posits the positive and absolute truth and can't prove it any more than we can? The physical sciences come closest, but even there, Werner Heisenberg and the uncertainty principle pose certain problems with the statement that this is the way it is, this, only thus, and thus absolutely. No, not quite that. And then in the humanities and the human sciences, good heavens, and in education theory, and in psychology, oh dear. No, I think history, by the cautions that it imposes, does a good deal to defang the dangers that hang over some of our parallel and companion disciplines without quite the same restraints. The challenge then here is to be fair in interpreting human experience. And one way I found to have some fun with that is to try to take a figure of agreed upon heroic virtue from the past, and usually, secretly, one from the present also, and try to find the worst I can say about that person on the evidence. Yes, he was a brilliant philosopher, but he played around. He was a superb musician, but he drank. He was a genius of a sculptor, but a liar. To do that, it's possible to find reasons to be restrained in admiration of people, but fairness. I then try to take the worst examples of human beings and find the best that I can say of them on the evidence. Yes, Genghis Khan was a mass murderer and a megalomaniac, but he never betrayed a friend. Yes, it's conceivable, it's arguable, but defensible that Adolf Hitler was the worst man who ever lived, but he had a wonderful singing voice. And, by the way, speaking as a meat-eating, drinking, smoking person, he was a non-smoking, teetotaling vegetarian. Obviously a natural ecologist, as well as a natural health addict. Well, when you find that you can say that there are some redeeming human virtues in a person who shows some rather unredeemed human viciousness, it also helps to balance the scales of interpreting anything human, past or present, and historical or personal, including friendships and relationships of every kind. It's when you come up with the fact that the only redeeming feature of an historical villain is that he's a whiz at bridge, or the only condemning feature of a notorious heroine and role model of female perfection is that she didn't cut her toenails. you know you've probably hit on somebody who in the one case is pretty bad and the other case is really quite good indeed. Find the mean. The search is fun, and the product is at least humility. And I found that to be a valuable lesson. And finally, poignance. It may be a crotchet in me, but I enjoy what the Japanese call aware, a sense of the transitoriness of things, especially those that are beautiful. That one sees something that one wishes to embrace and praise be permanent, so fine it is, and knows that it will pass, and perhaps very soon, and become memory, which is a rewarding remnant, but not quite the real thing. Yes, I remember the money that my father had and lost in the Depression. But remembering it with the affection that I have for it is not the same thing as having had it at hand to spend. And then there is the poignancy that attaches also to evil. But this is the joyful poignancy. And it goes in a category with that which attaches to beauty and goodness. This too shall pass. Nothing save the eternal is forever. And I use it when times are rotten, as the world seems to be, at least in some of its parts in these days, as a comfort. And I use it, as I suspect President Bush may have and should have done yesterday evening when things seem to be going very well, as a caution. Nothing save the eternal is forever. The past perfect. History is a study of the region of closed choices. Past perfect tense, action completed in past time, or in our case, approaching completion in time about to be passed. From this, I'm reminded of a lesson which is expressed pretty well in an old Anglo-Saxon couplet from the early days of the genesis of the English language. And I will quote it to you, not to show you that I know Anglo-Saxon, I don't, but that I can remember a fragment of it, which I can. Lief is lena, alles geketh jocht und livsomod. Life is fleeting, all passes, light and life together. But over against that pessimism, I set this: the matter of my discipline is the repository of those that I have enjoyed meeting from the past and those that I enjoy in the present who will presently be the past. And that leads me to remember another piece of poetry, one of Shakespeare's sonnets, which is, I think, my favorite of all of them. I'm still trying to find a colleague in the Department of English who agrees with me on this. But Shakespeare's sonnets number well over 100, and professors of English even more, so the odds are not very good of getting two to agree on one. Speaking of history, then, in Shakespeare's terms, with that modest adaptation, that the person addressed is the body of history and all it contains, and all those persons it contains, all my dead saints, my teachers, my late friends, my objects of human admiration and human derision and human reprobation. Thy bosom is endeared with all hearts, which I, by lacking, have presumed dead. And there dwells love, and all love's loving parts, and all those friends whom I thought buried. How many a holy and obsequious tear hath dear religious love stolen from my eye, as earnest of the dead, who now appear but things removed, that hidden in thee lie. Thou art the grave where buried love doth live, hung with the trophies of my lovers gone, who all their parts of me to thee did give. That dew of many now is thine alone. Their images I loved, I view in thee. And thou, all they, hast all the all of me. I proceed to the second of the three categories of sources of joy. And this is my colleagues in the academy. By virtue of being a professor of history, I could as well, but with less facility, have been a professor of something else. But by virtue of being a professor in any learned discipline, I have had as companions and members of my human environment fellow professors, fellow students, fellow teachers, scholars, friends, whose interest was in the intellect, in knowledge, in discovery, in truth, in exchange. To me, they have been companions in the central journey of my professional life, the journey of seeking, and quickeners, enliveners of thought. From some of these I have learned. I'll mention two. I could mention enough others to keep you here until you go to sleep. And so could each of you. I don't know how many of you can name all your grade school teachers. I can, because I loved every one of them. I was lucky to have such teachers. High school teachers. A score of memorable names. But I'll stop with two college professors. One, an undergraduate major professor of mine, a Jesuit father, Lyle Davis, whose message to all of us, and I took it to heart, was to believe nothing that we were told, whether by voice or in sources or in books, but to research and think and decide on the validity of it for ourselves. His battle cry was, if I can take the liberty of imitating the voice and inflection of a dead friend, "Don't believe me! Look these things up for yourselves!" And he was just about that full of asperity when he said it. And another Jesuit father, once chairman of my department, who gave me my position here a third of a century ago, Father Joseph Donovan, who, as he sensed his physical death approaching, in a letter to me, described the sensations, the physical sensations of that approaching death as, just between us, a good feeling, because it brought him close to the moment of intimate encounter with the God who had been gracious to him. From such people, one has much to learn. There are other people, living, dead, active, and retired, with whom I have enjoyed the pleasure of sharing common interests, ideas, values, views, tastes. It's been wonderful, because to find somebody who agrees with you and with whom you can agree, what's more flattering than that? You know, both of you, that you're right, and you're in the best possible company. And equally pleasant has been to find those with whom I have agreement in some of these things and disagreement in others, or a lack of developed taste in others, or they a lack of developed taste in something. And to find the pleasures of attempting at least to make converts out of each other, which sometimes works and sometimes doesn't, but it's always a compliment, always a gesture of friendship, and usually a pleasure. And then in this context, in the university, in the academy, according to the spirit of the academy and of the civil discourse that's supposed to be part of it, the utter pleasure of finding people with whom I disagree profoundly and who challenge tenets of mine, including some of my most preciously held and central tenets, but whose seriousness, thoughtfulness, civility, honesty, I have to respect, and with whom I can have discussions and not polemics or shouting matches. Discussions from which each of us learns something. Discussions which remind me again of what the material of the discipline teaches. There is more than one way to look at something. There is more than one hypothesis for every set of circumstances. Once or twice I've even changed my opinions under such influence, which is a little better than average for my friends. But the common bond between us in that is that which I suppose you could call the probe for truth and the acceptance of paradox in the Commedia Humana. There's some of it summed up in Pope's essay on man, the beginning of the second epistle, the first part of which is known to most people who have had a survey class in English literature. But I'll throw in a few lines from it. I've chosen to drop some out, including the very beginning lines. Speaking of the human, and this certainly includes the professorate, of all kinds and ages and both sexes and every discipline. But of course we flatter ourselves that it applies even more to those outside the professorate. A being in doubt to act or rest, in doubt to deem himself a god or beast, in doubt his mind or body to prefer, born but to die and reasoning but to err. Alike in ignorance his reason such, whether he thinks too little or too much. Created half to rise and half to fall, great Lord of all things, yet a prey to all, sole judge of truth, in endless error hurled, the glory, jest, and riddle of the world. And lest I put too great a burden on my colleagues as glory, jest, and riddle, let me add a few more lines that deepens the problem for them. Or in his very next section, Pope says, "Go, wondrous creature, mount where science guides, go measure earth, weigh air, and state the tides. Instruct the planets in what orbs to run, correct old time, and regulate the sun. Go teach eternal wisdom how to rule. Then drop into thyself and be a fool." Well, the human story again. The third of my sources of joy in the discipline of history has been, I suppose, for every teacher the same, even for those, that is, any who like to teach at all, those whose teaching is only an adjunct and an entry to their researches may have different feeling. John Locke and Isaac Newton seem to have been of that kind. Teaching either bored them or irritated them. But most people in the academy find some pleasure in teaching, whatever pleasure they take in other parts of their career. And here, the obvious source of joy is the student, the students. That part of the parade, going back years, decades, fractions of centuries, sometimes rather large fractions of centuries, of faces sometimes well remembered, and the names too, the faces sometimes well remembered and the names forgotten, names sometimes well remembered and the faces forgotten, and some both forgotten unless reminded of both. And then memory triggers the encounter and what was in it. What the student means to the professor, what the student has meant to me as a professor. Most preciously, in the first instance, an audience. Somebody to jaw to. I'm convinced that those who are lecture professors, and I am one, I excuse myself by saying, well, I went to school to the lecture method, I learned the lecture method, I practiced the lecture method, it's my life, I live it, I love it, critics be damned. But I suspect there is more than a little bit of the demagogue and more than a little bit of the megalomaniac in me, and in people who really enjoy being professors if their method is lecture, just as there would be for people who really enjoy being traffic policemen and awarding tickets, or examiners in universities and sitting in judgment on the futures of people's lives, hee hee. Feeling of almost godlike power. Well, it isn't godlike power. But nevertheless, without an audience, thoughts are harder to congeal, at least in my case, to firm up what I'm really thinking and get some inkling of where it leads. I have done more concluding about bits and pieces of my subject material in mid-sentence on my feet in front of a class, or at least as many as I have in a library carrel with sources around me, or even in the still hours of the night when sleep doesn't come and the mind runs on. And the response. An audience isn't an inert mass. An audience is a living part of the lecturer's life and presence. And the response, favorable or unfavorable, bored or excited, interested or indifferent, is part of the thrill of the encounter with the commedia humana. And then in tension and challenge with the function of the student as audience and an outlet for the professor's ego, wisdom, and a facility for the professor's clarity of thought, ongoing thought, there's the terrible obligation the professor has to the student not to pass along his or her own worst qualities, which means to be continually on the lookout for those qualities, not uniformly successfully by any means, but we try. And the dread of doing harm to those who come to you for enlightenment or assistance in self-enlightenment, or a guidance in the paths toward enlightenment, or the methods by which enlightenment might be pursued. And to try to leave them with an idea of the values and the morals of the discipline, and the problems of its material and of its interpreters, and still to excite them with the richness of its content. That I call an obligation, and we fail it at perils of our academic souls, possibly immortal ones. That's on my mind when I find myself responding to a class principally as an audience. Wait a minute, what are you doing to these people? You're unlimbering and firing off favorite hypothetical insights of yours. Right, but let's stop and call attention to the fact, lest in the process you encourage them to think they don't have to look these things up for themselves, or that your judgment is sufficiently final that they can take it and run with it and build life interpretations on it. Of course, the summit of all pleasure in students is in their futures, as our heirs in thought, in study, in the pleasure of learning, in the desire to seek truth, and very particularly in those whose memories are still green with us. There are at least three members of this faculty who long years ago were students of mine. I remember when they were. I have remembered them ever since. I remembered them in the years between the time they left my tutelage and the time they got jobs on the faculty here. And it's been my pleasure every day of their presence here to know them as people who excited me when they were young, and in whom I saw the promise that they have so amply fulfilled as fellow professors and former students. And I found over the years the deeper richness of mutuality in those relationships. Having former students stop me in a supermarket, on the street, even in one case in a foreign city, and say, "Do you remember when I had a class with you in 1962? And I will say yes, although I was on leave in 1962. But it would be rude to tell them that their memory is malfunctioning, because so is mine. I couldn't tell them which year it was, and they've given me the wrong year. Nevertheless, to have that memory, and usually, and this is not boasting, usually there is a kind of compliment attached to it. The greatest pleasure of all is when my memory works well enough that I can return the compliment. And then finding out what their lives have been since. And finding out that very many of those individuals consider that they gain something that has been of lasting value from having had an encounter with me and with other professors. That surely is the deepest of all the pleasures, and the highest, and the most wonderful, and the most nearly perfect. It's a kind of psychological immortality, at least for a short time. Well, these are the things that in my profession, my discipline, my work, I have found the sources of the best that I have known. I have found reason to accept, without great complaint, relatively low wages, a relatively modest lifestyle, the inevitably cranky relationship of administration and faculty, the inevitable political struggles, the inevitable campus issues, the occasional confrontation with an unfriendly student or with one that one must grade low and hates to do, the tedium of grading papers, and yet overall, looking back on that to say, not only has it been worthwhile, it has, on balance, been a great joy and a pleasure I would not have sacrificed for gold, at least short of a very large quantity of gold. And had I accepted a large quantity of gold, I would now be sitting in my chambers gloomily saying, why didn't I give up this wealth and stay with the students, with the friends, and with the discipline that made me feel happy? All this makes me feel as rich. My envoi is addressed to those that I have known, the dead in the remote past, the dead from the recent past, the living of all degrees becoming past, to those I have met in long journeys, to those I have shared journeys with, to those I've sent to the past that is in their future, to those who have made all efforts and sacrifices worthwhile and the burden of memory pleasant, who has made me glad not to be immortal, for I know I am not, but quite willing to face death in a spirit of gladness for having lived. Now, of course, there are many other parts of my life that have weighed into that attitude. But in the professional part of it, these things have, and to these people, living and dead, I offer a final, small, poetic reminder. None shall part us from each other. One in life and death are we. All in all to one another, I to thee, and thou to me. Thou the tree, and I the flower. Thou the idol, I the throng. Thou the day, and I the hour. Thou the singer, I the song. All in all, since that fond meeting, when in joy I woke to find mine the heart within thee beating, mine the love that heart enshrined. I the stream, and thou the willow. I the sculptor, thou the clay. I the sea, and thou the billow. I the sunrise, thou the day. And so, farewell. Russian way. The speaker applauds the audience in gratitude for being applauded by the audience. I will leave you with the Japanese phrase, respecting your applause, Domo arigatou gozaimasu. Thank you very much for what you've been doing.